Okay, we're at 3 o'clock, so let's get started. Hello and welcome to the Post-Fire webinar series. My name is Carrie Berger and I'm the manager of Oregon State University's Extension Fire Program. The Fire Program is a new program and extension, and we are gearing up as we speak to help facilitate landscape scale cross-boundary management projects on the ground and also to provide education and outreach to all Oregonians. Much like our Forestry and Natural Resource Extension colleagues, the Fire Program team will be living and working in communities throughout Oregon. I want to begin by acknowledging that many of you have lost everything to the wildfires that occurred this year. It is an extremely stressful and painful time with challenges that are affecting some of us in deeper ways than others. Know that you are not alone. Some of our partnering organizations and agencies will offer services and assistance in different ways. Some of those of you who have lost homes and belongings, businesses, and also sadly your pets. It is not our intention to undermine the severity of those losses, but to acknowledge with respect and as much understanding as possible. For this post-fire webinar series, we will focus on impacts to forestry and natural resources on your property. So for example, impacts to water, soil, and vegetation. Check out the Fire Program online class guide for information on upcoming webinars. Before we begin, I have some webinar logistics that I'd like to quickly cover. This session is being recorded, and all webinar recordings can be found on our Forestry and Natural Resource Extension YouTube channel. We are also streaming live on the Extension's Facebook page. So just a shout out to everybody on Facebook. For you all in the webinar, your audio has been muted. If you are having audio troubles and are connected to your computer's audio, I suggest hanging up and dialing in with your phone. You can always post a question in the chat window if you are having technical difficulties. Tiffany Hopkins, my wonderful colleague, will be monitoring the chat window and can help you out. Thanks so much for that, Tiffany. If you have a question on the information that is being presented, please type your question into the Q&A window. We plan to pause at about 3:45 and again at 4:40 for a question and answer session with our presenters. Finally, you can adjust how you view your presenters by going to the upper right corner of your screen. You might choose to see all presenters at once or just the person who is actually speaking. So during last week's webinar titled After the Fire, Now What?, we heard from Extension and agency partners about an After the Fire checklist, which helps you to chart a course forward. The presenters recommended folks take photos and connect with your local resources. Information from last week's webinar can be found on the Fire Program website, and my co-host Tiffany is adding these links to the chat box, and I will also provide resources to you in a follow-up email. So today we have with us Amanda Rao, and Amanda is the new Regional Fire Specialist for the Forestry and Natural Resource Extension Fire Program. Her fire service area includes the Willamette Valley and North Cascades. We also have with us John Punches, who is in Forestry Natural Resource Extension and is a forestry agent serving Union, Umatilla, and Wallowa counties. We'll have two presentations, one from Amanda describing what to look for in identifying tree hazards, and one from John talking to us about factors influencing soil stability and erosion in post-fire forested landscapes, and also then practical steps to mitigate those impacts. Each presentation will be followed by a 15 to 20 minute time for question and answers. If you don't catch all the information presented, don't worry. I'll provide all the resources mentioned during this webinar on our Fire Program website under the Past Classes resource page. And I'll even follow up like I said earlier, with an email just to be sure you get the information. Okay, let's get started. Amanda, go ahead when you're ready.
Thank you so much, Carrie. And thank you everyone for joining us today for our webinar. I'm going to start off with my presentation, which I still need to share with you guys. So give me just a second. Is that showing up? All right.
It is, it looks great.
Awesome. All right, thank you so much. I just wanted to start off by telling you really briefly about myself and my experience with hazard trees in the fire environment. I have worked as a wildland firefighter since 1999 for federal agencies as well as the Nature Conservancy and now Oregon State University. And during that time, I was fortunate enough to develop skills and be mentored in hazard tree felling. In fact, most of my experience with falling trees is on wildfires in hazard tree scenarios. I became an advanced faller in 2008 and was able to do that work for about 10 years. So I was able to develop a lot of experience and skill sets that helped me throughout my career, and now I'm able to share that with you. So to begin, let's talk a little bit about what qualifies a tree as a hazard. It's considered hazardous if it has any defects or structural weaknesses present that might cause failure that results in some damage to property or injury, or in even the worst case scenario, death. So a tree has to have something that it could impact in order for it to be considered hazardous. There's a lot of trees on the landscape that have all these defects and structural weaknesses, but as to whether or not they're considered a hazard really ties directly back to what the consequences of the failure of that tree really are. So to put it in another way, we need to have a weakened tree. This photo here was taken down on the Archie Creek fire recently, so this is a fairly recent example. You need a target, which this is just really a stock photo, but as an example, a car or something of value to us as humans. And that's how you end up with a hazard tree. Another thing I wanted to point out, and I think is really important as you are looking at hazard trees, especially if it's on your property, is to remember that the tree itself is a hazard, and you're technically a target if you're there looking at it, but then you've got other hazards in the environment because of fire. Fire tends to destabilize vegetation and some of the material that covers soil, the duff layer, that also kind of helps keep things intact in the environment. So once that stuff's burned up, it tends to loosen rocks, as well as trees and other material, allows them to move more freely, especially if a rain event occurs, which then compounds that impact. So as just a reminder, the environment around the tree that you might be looking at as a hazard it could be just as dangerous as the tree itself and needs to be assessed as well. So I just wanted to talk a little more about what targets are, and that really amounts to a potential consequence when it comes to an assessment of a hazard tree. Obviously, people and you just being near that tree are a potential consequence or a target. Paths, trails, and roads. Utility lines are other targets, and of course, people's homes and other buildings. So really any kind of improvements on the landscape that are interfacing with a fire area where trees have been compromised are considered targets and therefore potential consequences of a failure of a tree. Some of the pre-fire factors in tree failure actually relate to post-fire factors, but I think it's important to start with what impacts the tree's failure without fire. So some species are more prone to decay and failure than others, or they have shallow roots that allow them to tip over more easily. Of course, the older the tree, across the board, for the most part, the older the tree, the less likely it is to resist failure. Decay compromises the structure and the integrity of the wood, and wounds and cankers contribute to that decay, so do seams. The lean of the tree, and as a general rule, anything over about 15 degrees of lean is considered a hazard. the angle of the branches and what kind of types there are, how vigorous the crown is, how it's shaped, the form, and what condition the roots are in. So for a visual representation, you can see here what those kinds of visual indicators of potential tree failure look like. Cankers in the sides or burls, for example, a lightning strike or crack that is formed, missing wood or bark, evidence of insect damage and exit holes, cracks in the trunk, the cavity, the basal cavity being open, damaged or broken roots, sawdust or evidence of any kind of internal insect damage. Heaving of soil, so the sort of cracking and signs that the soil itself is compromised, and that may indicate that the roots are also having trouble holding that tree upright. Conchs and fungi are evidence of internal decay, bark that is missing or torn off, and any kind of wound cavities from pruning or broken branches. All of those are examples of indicators that could lead to the tree failing in one way or another. So we move on to the list of post-fire factors in tree failure. First up is species. It's similar, although actually quite different in some ways from the species that are known to fail if they haven't been burned. Trees that are resinous tend to actually resist fire, whereas some of the non-resinous trees can be ones considered to fail more readily if they're not burned. So there could be a little confusion generated there. We're going to focus on the post-fire factors, not really talking too much about those unburned tree failure factors. So moving on through the list, we have, of course, roots burning out compromises the tree's ability to stay upright. Loose overhead limbs, commonly referred to as widowmakers, but I try to not use that term too much, but I want to reference it here because a lot of people have heard that term. Hollowed out boles of the tree, so the actual stem of the tree itself burning internally and being hollowed out. Trees that are leaning or root sprung, heavy limb weight on one side of the tree versus another, and that's particular to fire because often fire will burn up one side of the tree and not the other and leaves a lot of that weight on one side. Broken or uprooted trees that are supported by other trees, sometimes called leaners or hung up trees. Cat faces and other impacts to the percentage of sound bolewood. The incineration of other indicators of weakness. So when conchs or mushrooms are normally present, fire will sometimes burn those up, and then that leaves no evidence that there is some of that weakness inside the tree. And then living versus dead trees. Now I'm going to go into detail on all those, but I wanted to show you this picture with fire added to kind of illustrate that an already weakened tree is only going to be further weakened if it's exposed to fire. And in fact, a lot of those same entry points that allow for decay and other compromising factors of the tree to occur are also places that fire likes to get itself established. So when you have those basal cavities, or you have missing bark, or you have wounds from pruning, those are places that fire tends to be able to get established more readily than if the tree's bark is all intact and there isn't any of those existing potential failure indicators. Just going into a little more detail about resinous versus non-resinous tree species, that really has to do with its resistance to decay. So true fir species and hemlocks typically are not as decay resistant because they don't contain as much resin, meaning they're a little more prone to decay, and that means they're more prone to fire as well. Spruce is kind of in the middle, but the Douglas fir, larch, pine are all considered resinous species, and so therefore decay resistant. Cedar is kind of an exception because it is decay resistant, but it's not resinous. And then hardwoods are actually decay resistant, even though they're not resinous. And in many ways, they are resistant to fire as well. Looking at some of the ways in which burned out roots can impact a tree's ability to stay upright and its likelihood of failure. This can be very difficult to see at times, especially until you're right up on the tree, and oftentimes you're then really in the strike zone and in a place where you may not want to be, depending on how likely that tree is to fail. getting a good assessment around the ground to see that is super important. And sometimes you can't see it. Sometimes fire will burn underground in the roots and it's not really visible unless there's been some excavation of the earth around the roots to show that the compromise has occurred. So developing that awareness and paying close attention to the ground as much as the overhead is very important. And we'll talk a little bit about an overall assessment later in my presentation. Those loose overhead limbs I was talking about, generally speaking, fire occurs, it will compromise those limbs staying in place, or if there already was a limb that was hung up, it may come down more readily because fire has further compromised the limbs and the structure of the tree. Hollowed boles are super important to pay attention to, and sometimes they can't be seen either. I had one experience on a wildfire on the Willamette National Forest in 2008 where a large green tree and it was so tall there was no way you could really see the top of it from the ground, had gotten an ember established in the top, and it had burned its way all the way down through that tree. Everything on that tree was green. It didn't look like it had been burned at all, and it fell and hit a vehicle. So hollowed out boles are significant and something that you definitely want to pay attention to and be aware that it's possible that something could be burning down inside a bole of a tree without really you being able to see it, and that assessment factor may not reveal that. So be aware of that. For the most part, you'll be able to see it, and then finding out how much of that bole is actually consumed will help you decide how likely it is to fail. Leaning or root sprung trees greater than that 15-degree angle have a higher likelihood of failing than if they're standing more upright. And when you have both of those conditions at the same time, it's an even stronger indicator of potential failure. So that cracking, the heaving of the soil around the roots, showing that the roots are starting to detach from the ground and moving with gravity and that greater power of that tree wanting to fall over. As I was talking about before, that heavy limb weight that's left on one side of the tree has the potential to pull the tree over even if there aren't other factors at play. And this is especially true if the tree is still green, because there's that moisture content of the tree that's still present that can really overcome a lot of other factors in deciding that tree needs to end up falling onto the ground. So being careful to notice that and pay attention to that as you're assessing hazardous trees in your area is very important. Trees that are broken or uprooted trees that are supported by other trees are considered to be inherently hazardous. They don't have anything really securing them to the ground. So whatever they're leaning into is what they're relying upon for staying up. And if what they're leaning into is not really adequate to support them, there's a higher likelihood that they will come down. And those trees are also generally challenging to get on the ground when mitigating the hazard as well. A little history on the term cat face, because I personally worked in fire and forestry for many years before fully understanding the origin of the term. I always thought it was strange that it didn't really look like a cat face to me. But the origin of the term is actually from the southeastern United States, where longleaf pine would be scored for extracting turpentine, and those scars on the tree were more prone to catching fire. And so that's how the term cat face came about. They actually can lead to things like the compromised bole wood that we saw in a previous slide. But oftentimes these cat faces burn and they actually don't cause any more problems than just a slight compromise of the base. And as to whether they actually result in a hazard tree, it is something that will come out of a more thorough assessment. And I'll explain that process here shortly. So that absence of external decay indicators, as I had mentioned, can be a potential problem. So in this case, you have, the potential, the indicators are present. There's mushrooms at the base of this tree, so that means there's likelihood that there's some problem with that tree's root system. But if a fire had come through here and burned all those mushrooms off, then you wouldn't have that indicator. So, an absence of an external decay indicator is not as useful of a slide as showing you what what that indicator looks like in the first place. So if you see a little mushroom that's shriveled up at the base of the tree that's burned that you think might be a hazard, then pay attention, because that could be something like this. So looking at live versus dead trees all should really be considered to have a higher potential for failure, just by virtue of the fact that they're dead and they're no longer doing all the work that trees do to stay upright and be healthy and not fail. But that doesn't mean that live trees should automatically be considered to have a low potential for failure. It's really just on the dead tree side that, pretty much puts it in a higher potential rating, whereas live trees could end up anywhere on the spectrum. You could have a low potential failure for a live tree that was slightly impacted by fire, but there wasn't enough there to consider it to be a hazard. Whereas it could be burned out, have, limbs hanging loose and cracks and all kinds of other indicators that while the tree's live for now, probably doesn't have a lot left in it, might die in, the next few years anyways, and should be treated as a hazard. So important to delineate between live versus dead trees. So now we're moving into post-fire hazard assessment and looking at what that process looks like. And there's a couple different processes I'm referencing here. So I'll talk a little more about that. But the basic across the board principle that we use is that these assessments are based on probability. So it's likelihood of something happening, and there's some assumptions about the future made. So when we say, is the tree likely to fall or fail? That's more or less, probabilistic. When is it likely to fail? Well, we could say we don't think it's going to fail, but then a big windstorm comes up, and that ends up being the tipping point for that tree. And then is there a target likely to be present if and when the tree fails and falls? And that's another assumption about the future. Will someone be in that area, or will the value at risk be still in the area? Is it something that can be moved or not? So these are steps to develop a tree risk rating, and this is based on the International Society of Herborists and a process that Steve Fitzgerald has recently presented. And so you start by first identifying the target. That's really the important piece. Is there something at risk? And then you identify what might strike the target. That could be lots of different parts of the tree, or it may just be one part of it. Then you want to look at what is the likelihood for each of those parts to fail. Is it improbable? Is it imminent? Is it going to happen at some point, or is it unlikely? Looking at the likelihood of a tree or part impacting the target. So there could be a target on one side of the tree, and then there's a loose limb hanging on the other side, and it's not going to impact the target. Well, then, so there's a different rating that would go on there. And for each of these modes of failure, we want to look at that. How likely is that tree failure to impact a specific target? For each mode of failure, you want to estimate the consequence of that failure. So if it's an old picnic table that no one ever uses that happens to be sitting below the tree, and it does get hit and nobody's ever there anyways, is that maybe a negligible consequence? Versus your brand new house that you just built, and realizing that then there's a tree that has been impacted that maybe you want to make sure you take care of because the consequence is very high. Looking at what some of the work that ODOT's been doing mitigating hazards around our road corridors, those consequences are very high for those trees to fall down, hence why we've had a lot of closures of highways and management of travel to make sure that those trees that have those high consequences of failure have been mitigated. And then the outcome, of course, is a risk for each mode of failure. And this is all really to give you an idea of what kinds of thought processes occur when considering assessment of hazard trees, not because you're expected to just take all this information and go apply it. In fact, we wouldn't necessarily recommend you do that, but really just to understand the principles and the thought processes so that you can engage in your best interests. So these two concepts of likelihood and risk and potential consequences I've talked a lot about, but they really play out in this matrix that is used for tree risk assessment. And so you have the likelihood of failure and the likelihood of impacting a target, anything from very likely to unlikely. And if the likelihood of failure is high and the likelihood of a target being impacted is high, then we say it's very likely. And that feeds into table 2, which is really the risk matrix. And that's showing you a combination of likelihood of a tree falling and the impacting of a specific target with the associated consequences. So I get back to that concept of, if nobody's sitting at that picnic table, then, maybe that's not quite as severe of a consequence. Whereas if it's something really valuable, then it ends up on that higher end. This is another approach that is taken by U.S. Forest Service. This is from a guide that they have created to help managers in developed recreation sites. So that's very similar in terms of looking at values at risk outside of an area that has burned. And they rate based on very low failure potential through high failure potential, and then no damage up to extensive damage, and come up with a rating number that's also color coded that runs from 2 to 8. I've seen a couple of these in the Forest Service that have higher numbers systems used, like 1 through 10. But the concept is all very, very much the same. If you're talking about live trees with no defects at all, then you're pretty much assuming there's not much in terms of failure. Whereas if you end up on the high failure potential side of things, as in all dead trees, like I was saying earlier, live trees that are highly defective, decay extent in live trees that has rendered the tree below the acceptable sound rind thickness, which I am not getting, really too much into here. I will talk a little bit about it, but that's, where things are likely to fail in that tree. And then the damage potential, which is, kind of similar to the other rating system that I just showed from ISA. If you don't think there's any damage, that's obviously on the low end. And then extensive damage, meaning that medium to large tree parts or entire trees, and impacts will be direct in areas with target value is high. Damage to property, severe or serious personal injury or death is likely. And in this case, they're looking at tent-sized parking areas, et cetera, but that's easily translatable to values in other landscapes. This is from their guide, and it's looking specifically at what the fire potential of failure potential of fire damaged trees is. And they're looking at fire damage within 5 years. There's a reason for that, I think, because after 5 years, other forms of wounds and decay start to take over, and that's where they default to bowl wounds. And that's where you really get into that sound rind thickness of 20% of the stem diameter as high failure potential, going all the way down to no, where there's the sound rind thickness is greater than 30%, or it isn't an issue. But if we're looking at just fire damaged trees within that 5-year period, trees that have less than 50% of the cross section of the bowl with sound wood, or more than 1 quadrant of the damaged structural roots, is considered high failure potential. Trees that have 50 to 75% cross section of the bowl wood is sound, and 1 quadrant of the damaged structural roots, with the exception of cedar, ponderosa pine, sugar pine, and larch, because of that resinous content. So they have an exception here that they're more resilient to fire and less likely to fail. And then you get down to that low failure potential, where those cedar, ponderosa pine, sugar pine, and larch have to have, or if they have greater than 50% of that cross section of bowl wood as sound, they're considered to be of low failure potential. And then, of course, all trees that have 100% of that bowl wood intact on a cross section and don't have damaged structural roots. And that gets back to the roots being really key. And so this is just to give you an idea. I think that this cross section of boll wood is a really nice kind of guide that you can remember easily. So if you're out there and you see trees that have less than half of that cross section, of any kind, you want to stop and think about it and then look at what species they are and if it happens to fall within any of those resident species that have a higher percentage of their cross-section that can be lost and still be considered sound. You can start thinking through that in that way. I have seen in my experience on wildfires many times folks who don't quite have this knowledge and want to take a lot of trees down just because they think they might be hazardous, and I think that's a common thing. But this is really where the science is telling us is that some of these trees can actually be okay and survive fire, indeed, especially if they still have green in their canopy. If you pay attention to some of these metrics. Switching over to the failure potential of leaning, root sprung, broken, and uprooted trees. And I want to highlight too really quickly that line across the top that says dead trees. In this table, which is many pages long in the guide, every time it says dead trees, all are high failure potential no matter what. So that does, kind of take out some of the guessing game if your trees are dead. But if they're broken or uprooted trees that are supported by other trees, it's the same. So treat those as dead trees. But once you get into the leaning and or root sprung trees, if their lean is recent, then greater than 15 degrees, or an old uncorrected lean that's associated with freshly disturbed soil or root damage. So that's something to consider there. There's that combination of root sprung or disturbed soil or root damage with the lean compounds the risk and really puts it in that high failure potential area. Trees with recent lean that is greater than 15 degrees, but they have old uncorrected lean, but they don't have that fresh damage, are considered medium. And then low failure potential is trees with those old corrected lean, meaning the tree's been leaning for long enough that it has adapted to it and it's not really considered to be as much of a risk anymore. So we're going to move into options for hazard mitigation, talking a little bit about what you can do, or maybe what you shouldn't try to do. Just as a general rule, if you're in doubt, just flag an area off, call a professional arborist to come in and help, especially if it's really, really close to something that you're going to be in the area of a lot. I just can't emphasize this enough, especially if you know enough about chainsaws or filling to do a few things, but maybe not enough to take care of something seriously hazardous. I know it's easy to get in over your head, and so I just highly recommend calling a professional, even if it's just to assess or confirm what you think you're seeing, getting a second pair of eyes. And if you're qualified and skilled and know what you're doing, that's totally your call. But I really encourage finding somebody who's licensed, bonded, and insured, and is certified as an arborist to come take a look to help you out with that. The process of inspecting and assessing hazards is in of itself something you need to take seriously as far as safety goes. And I started off my presentation with that for a reason. Because the fire environment is just an inherently dangerous place for a period of time until it has started to stabilize. So you want to make sure when you're going in that you have entry into and exit from the area surrounding the tree established as safe for yourself and anyone else that is there. And if you can't make sure that happens, then flag it off and call a professional. If you're going to start looking and assessing, then you can either start at the tree bottom or the tree top. I've seen both recommended, and I decided to offer both to you here as options because I think it really depends on the height, the extent of damage, and those initial observations of potential failure. If you know from standing far back as you walk up to the tree that the top is like hanging by a thread, then you should probably start from the top in your assessment as opposed to starting at the bottom. Use binoculars if you have them, because that can really help you get a closer look from far away. I really recommend this for whether it's a hazard assessment or a felling operation, to look at your tree from every angle at 4 points at a minimum, but really walk around that whole thing and look at it top to bottom to see every possible hazard that could be there. As you're doing that, you can look for targets, looking at what the tree might hit, and then document some of your results. There are some tools for that. You can use a hazard assessment for decision making, and the process can be documented to help you remember what you saw and pass that information on to someone else. You can also limit access. I think this is an underutilized tactic. And, it's a question of what's more dangerous, trying to get the hazard mitigated by getting it on the ground or pruning it or removing the hazard or flagging it off. I posted or I included this wildfire closure statuses of today from ODOT as another example. That's what they're basically doing, is they're limiting access so that they can get in and mitigate these hazards. At some point, they're going to open things up again, and that's no longer going to be an issue. But just really understanding that flagging an area off, closing it off, closing a road, closing a trail, and sometimes maybe just letting the winter take its course and coming back to see if Mother Nature went ahead and took care of that hazard for you is really, that could be the best possible option. Not putting someone at risk who would have to go in and try to make that hazard go away and just letting it take care of itself. That's clearly not an option in many cases where there's high level of exposure, but if it's a possibility, I think it's something to be considered. Of course, you can move the target. These are kind of, less than ideal, I think, in many ways, but if it's something as simple as moving that picnic table, like I was talking about before, then maybe consider doing that. It may be just the best thing that you could really do for yourself and for others. And then just really developing that awareness. And, this is really what this whole presentation is about today, is learning how to recognize hazard trees in the environment after a fire, understanding their potential, and then knowing who to call for more assistance. And with that, I am finishing up and opening it up for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Amanda, for that presentation. And like Amanda said, go ahead and put your questions for Amanda in the Q&A box, not in the chat, but in the Q&A. Just a shout out to our Facebook folks who are watching us live. We are talking today about hazard tree awareness and erosion in post-fire landscapes. I've already introduced Amanda. She was just our speaker. We also have on the line with us John Punches and Tiffany Hopkins from Extension. There was a couple of panelists who came on just after we got started. Daniel Lavelle, he's our Extension state fire specialist with the fire program. We also have Catherine Roden on the line from NOAA and Katie Lumpa from the Oregon Department of Forestry. So I just wanted to make you all aware of the panelists we have today and available to help answer the questions. So I'm going to go ahead, Amanda, and start moderating those questions. And we had one come in really early that Katie took a stab at, and I'm just going to read it out loud for the benefit of the whole group, because I think her recommendation is a good one. And Katie, if you wouldn't mind sharing that link in the chat box. My burned old forest of mostly 100-year-old spruce is on a steep slope. How do you find a forester and a mill that will log this, and what can be done in the meantime to prevent erosion while we search? And that might be maybe a later question for John, but any perspective now for that question?
So I don't have an answer to the question about the spruce, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. And Katie recommended, connecting with the Oregon Department of Forestry has stewardship foresters all across Oregon. She's going to put that link in the chat window for y'all if she's still with us here. I guess we'd recommend connecting up with a Oregon Department of Forestry stewardship forester. and they would give you some recommendations for that question. And okay, there we go, there it is. So on, someone asked, on this chart, what about lodgepole? And I think they were referring to that chart where you had dead, and you just went over that. Okay, you got that.
Yeah, the lodgepole is considered a resinous species. So it falls within that, but as far as being decay resistant, yes. Relative to decay resistance, yes, and it is resinous.
Great. Okay. How does one measure the percentage of bole fire damage on trees that are marginally damaged?
Okay, so the way that I would recommend doing that is, and it's going to be an approximation, but you know, you could do, like, you could measure the diameter at breast height of the tree and then approximate about how much of that basal area, really, because it's starting at the base, has been compromised. If the compromise is further up and it's not right at the base, you just start wherever the most compromised area is, and then approximate about how much of that circle has been removed by fire, because that's the point of weakness, is wherever that smallest amount of rind is left.
Great. Amanda, I'm just going to circle back to the question I initially asked, because there's a lot of chatter going on in the chat. We have some really great recommendations. Of course, I forgot ourselves. You can always contact your OSU Extension Forester for help on that question. And also water conservation folks can help as well. We also have a note in the chat. You can find an ISA certified arborist on treesaregood.com. Specifically, look for an arborist that is qualified as a tree risk assessor. And then Tiffany just gave you the link of our extension foresters. Okay, so comments about assessing domino situations where multiple trees reach a target.
Oh my goodness. Well, that becomes an increasingly more complex when you've got multiple trees upon trees leaning into other trees. And it gets back to call the professional, because unless you're skilled in dealing with that, you're going to have to walk your way through that hazard. And it's so hard to give a prescription of what you would do with that situation without being there and looking at it and coming up with a plan. But suffice to say, there's ways to do that. It sometimes doesn't involve a person with a chainsaw right up on it because it's just too dangerous. Sometimes trees just have to be pushed over with equipment or pulled out with equipment. There's lots of different tools and methods for mitigating the hazards, and we could do a webinar on that too, but really this was more about, okay, what are you looking at? And so that would be, you know, one of those compounded situations with one tree leaning on or hung up in another and another. And, you know, sometimes you can fall a big tree into that situation to take care of it and be relatively out of harm's way. But, you know, that's a lot to do. Whereas, you know, having someone who has equipment or skills in mitigating that would probably be the best bet.
Great, thank you for that. We have another question in from Joel who asks, what if the target, like a house, has not been rebuilt yet? Is that area still a target?
Oh, wow, that's a really good question. I mean, it all gets back to the value of that target. So if you have a feeling or a reason for not wanting the tree to hit it, even though it's already had all the damage done possible, I mean, things like, is there a foundation there you still plan on using? If so, maybe you wouldn't want that tree hitting that foundation. Yeah. Daniel, did you have something to add?
I did, Amanda, please. I'd like to kind of emphasize what you were saying about developing a plan, in that when you assess the hazard as to what level of risk it is, probability and consequence, like Amanda was saying, look at those trees and look at the sensitivity of the soil. You know, on the Coast Range, it could be a sandy soil. It could be more, it could add to that hazard. And look at the slope percent. Of course, steeper the slope, the more hazardous it is. And before anyone goes into that area, or step back and have a plan for accessing it, for looking at all of those pieces and parts to it. Yeah, I've been on fires too, where a stiff wind, you know, you need to be very careful about the wind, and you need sometimes flag off hazardous trees if it's only a tree here or there, but really sign it off, prepare, plan it out, and I think it'd be much better to deal with this.
Great, thank you, Daniel. And again, just to remind you, Daniel Lavelle, he is the Extension State Fire Specialist for Oregon State University, and Amanda Rao, newly hired to the fire program team as our Regional Fire Specialist. She's talking to us today about hazard tree awareness. And so we've got a question in from Cindy. If the bark is burned and the needles are brown all the way to the top of the tree, is the tree compromised?
Well, by definition, if you assume that the tree is dead because of that, yes. It also depends on the species, though. So there's some epicormic sprouting hardwood trees that can lose the entirety of their crown and resprout and survive. Ponderosa pine can lose a fairly substantial amount, or have at least a fairly substantial amount of crown scorch and still survive. But there's a lot of other factors that really influence that. I would just make the assumption that it's going to fall into that higher rating category, but kind of gets back to what Daniel said, you know, sort of look at it in that holistic sense and consider the other factors. But yeah, suffice to say, it may not be a real hazard right now after just having that happen to it, but it's likely to become one. And so you'd want to treat it as such.
Great. Amanda, is there potential legal liability from trees, erosion, damaging neighboring property? And I'm going to encourage our panelists, if you want, go ahead and share your video and pop on. If you have the answer to any of these questions, you can answer along with Amanda. Is there potential legal liability from trees, erosion, damaging neighboring properties?
I'm not quite as certain about the erosion part, but I can say that across property boundaries, vegetation that sort of crosses over into someone else's property, you know, becomes kind of a shared problem. As to whether or not someone would be successful in suing you or not, that's another question, but I would say there is a liability associated with it. I just can't tell you how that would pan out in an actual, you know, litigious situation, or where there was an actual battle over it. I would probably try to take care of those and consider other people's property as a sort of target, but more so like, is there a fence there? Is it going to ruin the fence? If there's nothing, then I would say that the likelihood of a problem is less, but if that tree's leaning towards someone's house on the other side, then I would certainly say it would be something you would want to consider in that arena.
Yeah.
Daniel, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I support that fully. I think if a tree was a hazard on your property and it was 10 feet from the property line and it fell on your neighbor's car, or caused a consequential damage, I have known neighbors to get in that fight, and it is a liability issue. Can be, if and it has been.
So let's see here. Are there safer ways to evaluate hazard trees on steep slopes?
Well, I would say that I guess I don't have a textbook answer on that from, you know, the guides and things I read, but I can tell you from my own experience that your ability to move around in the woods is a lot, it's less, it's compromised when you're on a steeper slope. So if you're entering a hazardous area to look at a tree, you know, you're going to need to factor that in. And where are you and how easily are you going to be able to leave or egress if you notice something that could potentially be a threat to you. And I think it could mean that the mitigations would change. You know, what you can do on steep slopes with equipment, for example, is limited versus what you can do by hand. So I think some of your options will probably be affected if you have trees like that on steep slopes, and then their potential to travel and impact a target is greater because of, you know, gravity in their favor and whatever's downhill. You know, more often than not, trees fall downhill on their own. And so they can go further when they have a steep slope and gravity in their favor. So I would expand sort of your area of consideration down slope for target areas because of that. And also be aware that in particular on steep slopes, trees that are below the tree that might be a hazard are also going to become potentially impacted or become hazard if that tree falls into them and then creates further hazards. It's just definitely more complex once you get on steep slopes, both with the assessment and mitigations.
Absolutely. This person has been reading that trees are virtually dead if the cambium layer is compromised. How is that determined?
It depends on the species, and you know, like I showed you those cat-faced trees, right? Well, that's cambium injury that's been sustained, and there's trees that have had their cat faces reburn many times, and they're still fully alive and vigorous. So it's really the full cambial kill as opposed to just a wound that hurts the cambium. That's my understanding. There are people who know a lot more about trees here than I do, who might have something to say about that, though.
Carrie?
Yes.
This is Katie. So there are a couple of different things that people can do to take a peek at the cambium. One is that if the bark seems to be loose, they can peel back just a small area of that bark and look and see if the cambium, that layer that's right underneath the bark, actually should be a light green color, possibly, a bright green or to a light pale brown, light green. If it's a darker brown, then it's more than likely dead. The cambium layer is dead. Another way to do that, maybe on that would be more on a thinly barked tree, on maybe a tree that has a thicker bark on it. You could take a rubber mallet and tap, not pound on it, okay, but just tap on it. And if it sounds hollow underneath, the bark has probably split away from the cambium layer, and the potential is there that the cambium is dead. That's a couple of different ways. Again, the lifting of the bark, the color of the cambium layer. If there's substantial cracks that go into the tree, there's potential that the cambium actually ended up, for lack of a better way of putting it, stewing from the heat and causing that cambium to die. Did that help you out, Amanda, too? I'm sorry.
Absolutely.
We haven't met.
I know. That's great. Thank you so much.
Oh, and just to throw something in really quick with Katie and Amanda, that it's also a dryness factor too. You know, usually a live cambium has that sappy, that it's kind of liquid, and a dead cambium, correct, with it's colored differently, but it's also dry, and
Yes.
because the sap isn't flowing anymore. That's a good indicator.
Great, good answers. And Katie Lumpa, she's our partner with the Oregon Department of Forestry. Thank you so much, Katie.
bet.
Other question here, what about burn trees right on the riverbank with the roots completely exposed?
Well, that's often the case before the fire has burned. I guess, again, it kind of gets to what is the target. So if the tree isn't, I mean, there may be a higher likelihood of failure as a result of the fire further revealing roots. But if the tree leaning towards your house? Is it leaning towards something else that you care about? Or is it just leaning back into the river and not really a potential hazard? So I don't know about additional compromises of roots because they happen to be on the river, but I would treat it similarly as any tree that had roots exposed. Kind of getting back to whether or not they were exposed before, or if all the exposure is from the fire itself. I would certainly say if all of the exposure of those roots is from the fire, you're going to have to consider things like stream buffers, and I don't really know what the restrictions are when it comes to hazard trees and homes relative to those kinds of buffers. But you would want to make sure to consult with your stewardship forester and make sure that whatever you're doing is going to be good on both ends, both on the hazard mitigation side as well as protecting those kinds of corridors.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to drop down to Steve Gold's question here because it relates to the cambium. He says, the assessment framework makes a ton of sense to me. I have two large old Douglas fir, 150-year-old plus, with close proximity to a house with good percentage of canopy but very charred bark, up to 15 to 20 feet. Advice I have been given so far is to wait until next spring to assess the cambium layer. Do you agree with waiting?
I think Katie or Daniel might be able to better answer whether or not waiting would be a good idea on the cambium part.
Oh, and I would add, could he, what was the base like? Was the base burned very hot? And again, were you able to test the cambium like Katie and Amanda were saying at the base of the tree as well? Just a question.
Let's see. Steve, I've given you the ability to talk. So if you want to answer that question.
No.
Okay.
Because a lot of times the crown will be green. And
there he is.
Yeah.
Be limited char, but the base burned really hot. And
yeah, we believe that to be the case because there was a deck underneath it that caught fire, and it was a composite type deck, so it burned probably pretty intensively. But we haven't yet done the test that was just talked about. But the thinking of people actually from OSU was to sort of monitor it and look at it over the course of the next few months. The roots are deeply rooted into the riverbank. They're going one way because they're right on the top of the riverbank. And it's in basalt rock, and it's seems to be a very structurally sound. So I guess the thinking was, you're not risking much waiting till next spring to be sure. But then this risk assessment obviously puts a little bit more focus on the target, which is my surviving house.
Steve, this is Katie. Okay, so I'm presuming then that the deck went around the tree?
It was sort of underneath it at the base. Yes, not 360 degrees around, but at the base of each of the trees, there was this deck.
Do you see on the bark of those trees, does it look like it's scarred all the way around the trunks?
Well, it's more, it's sort of charcoal on the side where the deck was, and I'd say more just burned. You can still see the pattern of bark, so it hasn't been obliterated, but it's very sort of dusty and lacking in any kind of integrity on the side where the deck was.
It's a fairly thick bark, yes?
Extremely thick. I mean, these are probably 12 to 15 feet around. I mean, they're big trees.
I would recommend doing those type of tests if you can, specifically on the thicker bark. If you don't see cracks in it, meaning that the bark is actually away from the tree trunk itself, so away from the cambium layer, then yeah, have somebody with a rubber mallet just ever so slightly tap it to see if it seems like it's loose. But I'm a strong advocate for the ISA certified arborist tree risk assessor qualification. And I would recommend, seeing those trees are so large and went through so much, and they're so close to your home, which is a target, I would highly recommend having somebody with that expertise come in.
Sure. And so the link that's on this slide is the way to find them for Marion County. This is in the Lyons area.
No, that link is just to the guide, but we can follow up with that information. I think we should be able to follow up by the end of the webinar in our chat with that.
Thanks.
And one more comment real quick, please, is that the other way you can check it too, if if you can't get an arborist and you're letting the trees stand until winter, if that's your decision, the other thing you might consider doing is taking a hatchet and then take a chip on the base of the tree where it was burned, and perhaps in the bark of the tree, and get down to that cambium. Don't take too much at all. And then do the color check, the dryness check, the live dead cambium check. And that'll give you some signs and symptoms of whether that tree is going to die or not too.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thank you.
So, keeping in mind that if you are checking, you might need to check in more than one place on the tree, Daniel, right? Because the tree can survive if only a portion, one side, if you will, of the tree, less than 40%, I think is the amount. If the cambium is alive more than that, then its possibilities of surviving are there. And just to really quick, if you go to treesaregood.com and search for an arborist, you can find one of those arborists that way.
Great, thank you. Katie, Dan, and Amanda, and Steve, thank you for the question. We're gonna pause on the questions for now so that we can transition to our next presenter, John Punches. He's gonna be talking to us about erosion. And if the panelists, if they can, in the background, be answering some of the leftover questions, that would be fantastic. So John, thank you. Again, John is our extension forester at OSU, and whenever you're ready.
Right, are you seeing my first slide?
I sure can.
Awesome, great. So hi everybody, I'm John Punches and I'm the extension forester up in Northeast Oregon, which seems like a long ways away from where most of our fires were this summer, but actually my family home and where I am right now is in Douglas County. So I'm sitting right in the middle of all of this, and we were actually on evacuation notice, but praise the Lord, we didn't have to go anyplace, but lots of friends and folks up in the Glide area that were impacted by this. So if you're out there and were impacted, you have my sympathies, and hopefully we'll be able to provide you with some information that helps you recover and find a path forward. My task today is to talk about erosion, and there's no possible way I can do full justice to this in just 45 minutes, but hopefully we can give you some definitions and kind of a starting point and point you to some resources, and also get you kind of thinking about what is really important and maybe what's stuff that you don't need to worry about as much. So we'll kind of take it from that perspective of trying to get you to focus on the things that are most important in this immediate term. I'm also going to remind you that our focus is really on forests and natural resources. I'm not going to specifically get into things that you would do for stabilization on banks around your home and things like that, but I will kind of mention that and point you to some resources that I think can help with that process. So I want to remind you that last week, Daniel Lavelle and Steve Fitzgerald introduced this after the fire checklist, and this is available through the fire program website, and it's going to be linked to our class for this session today. But this is a really good guide to kind of walk you step by step through the process of evaluating your property after this fire event. And just as a reminder that while we're going to be talking about not only hazard trees today, but soil erosion, going back onto your property following a fire is inherently dangerous. And we really want to remind you and encourage you to take all of the appropriate prudent steps to protect yourself before you start really worrying about trees that might hit some remaining property or erosion that might cause land to slide. We mostly want you to stay safe. And so think about your appropriate equipment. Think about just evaluating those hazard trees from a distance before you even go in. I don't want you rushing in to evaluate soil and forgetting that there could be hazardous tree conditions above you. Really be cognizant of that. Make sure that you've got your hard hat if you're out there working in the woods and doing those assessments, along with the other prudent kind of equipment that it would take to do that. Daniel walked through the checklist kind of point by point, and last week Steve gave a really quick kind of introduction to some erosion issues. I'm going to go into some more depth. And I'm really going to focus on the second page of the assessment sheet. This one that asks you to look at your property and just give it your best guess as to how much was actually impacted by the burn, how much of the property, how many of your acres fall into each of these slope categories, because there are 5 acres that are 15%, so they fall in that first category, and 5 more in that second category, whatever it is, right? Just kind of get that rough estimate in there. Think about how intensely the vegetation burned, and I think you'll get more information on that from Steve Fitzgerald when he starts talking about thinking about timber salvage and things of that nature. I'm going to think mostly today about how severely the burn affected the soils, and so I'll get more into detail on that. Be thoughtful about where this is occurring across the landscape, because obviously there's a bigger hazard or risk, an impact, if soil movement gets into rivers and watercourses, or washes out your access road to your property, or ends up impacting your home, than if it just happens in the middle of the forest someplace where it really doesn't impact anything else. So just really want to be thoughtful about that whole context as you enter this process. And then as you work through the remainder of your assessment, there's going to be lots of pieces here, more so than what I'm getting in today, but some of these will be covered by Steve Fitzgerald in I think the next seminar where he's talking about salvage logging. But be thoughtful too about not only those hazard trees, but where there are property improvements, roads, ditches, culverts, anything of that nature that could potentially be impacted by hazard trees or by soil movement following the fire. So be thoughtful of that context as you move through. When we think about fires, it's really important to recognize that fires rarely burn uniformly across landscapes. So here's a recent photo taken in the Archie Creek fire in Douglas County. And just in this one photo, you can see that the left side over here of the road, that's probably what would be considered a low intensity burn. The right side of the road is probably what we consider a high intensity burn. And then up in the distance, when you look up at the mountaintop, that's probably what we would consider to be a high intensity burn up in here. And this is more of a moderate intensity burn. So low intensity, moderate intensity, high intensity, and all within a relatively confined space. And you're probably likely to have that across your property as well. So when we work through this process, what I want you thinking of is how can you kind of pragmatically determine and maybe map out the severity of that burn across your property. Now, as we speak, there are professionals that are working within the entire footprint of each of the burns that we've had in Oregon to do this process to really map out severity, but they're largely doing it using satellite photographs, and then they'll do some on-the-ground follow-up checking, but that's probably going to occur mostly on federal lands. That's where they have the authority and permission to operate. So we, through Extension, will be providing access to those burn severity maps once they become available, and that can be a good resource for thinking about the impact on your property. But really, these are done at a larger scale. And so I'd like to help you today to think about how you can apply these concepts more locally on your property and develop something that really gets at this idea of how severely did the landscape burn in your part of the world, right in your property. And a way to do this, I mean, we recommend as part of that checklist that you develop a simple map. And if I were doing it, I would probably go into one of the online sources of aerial photographs. You could do it with Google Earth if you know where your property is and can identify the property boundaries. Another good resource for finding a moderately recent aerial photograph with the property boundaries already applied is something called ormap.net. So just the letters ormap.net. And this is a site that contains assessor data for all the properties in the state. And you treat it almost like Google Earth. You zoom into it and you just get closer. And pretty soon it comes up and shows you property boundaries. And so I'm going to demonstrate today kind of a thought process for developing a fire intensity or fire severity map, just using this as a background tool, because I think it's useful. Even though the trees in the fire may have disappeared or the landscape may look differently, if this is your property, I'm pretty sure you're going to know which parts of these burned, and these tree locations and locations of the roads and structures are going to help you kind of sort out where things are on the property. So for instance, this is a colleague.
Sorry about that. I really hate to interrupt you, but it sounds like you're about to take off in an airplane. Do you have okay.
So unfortunately, my computer is running its fan at full blast right now because I'm using the internet and all of these things. So I don't know how to get around that. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but we're getting some comments in the chat that there's a lot of feedback. So apologies, folks. Just bear with us. Steve has a lot of great information to share, and I can definitely hear what you're saying. It's just a little, it does sound like you're about to take off.
Yeah.
And maybe you are. I don't know. We'll see at the end of the presentation.
Yeah. We can try something here if you want to wait just a minute.
That's amazing. That totally fixed it.
Better.
Okay, so that's a different microphone, different camera, and I think it's further away from my airplane.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Stay grounded. Don't take off.
We're gonna, yeah. Okay. So I'm gonna walk you through this process and just think about how we can maybe design some type of map here that would be really low input, easy to do, and we're just gonna think about how we can develop that off this really commonly available resource. Again, it's ormap.net. There's lots of other resources you can use, but this is one I commonly utilize when I'm writing management plans for people. And so if we start with this, we might just think about how we can, I got to get it to move now, just kind of identify first the areas that didn't burn. And so pretty common that when you identify these, the fire severity maps will just identify green areas as things that didn't burn. That's a pretty obvious kind of choice of color there. And so green area, and just kind of label them, right? And this could be done on your computer, or you maybe would just print this map and then just kind of hand write these in. But this is going to be useful when you start talking to like NRCS technicians and other potential sources of funding or assistance to help them get a sense of what they're going to have to work with when they actually make that visit to your property and try to line you up with resources. And so in this case, we've just kind of noted some areas that would be relatively unburned. And then it's pretty easy to identify the areas that are severely burned. I mean, that's kind of intuitive. And so maybe there's just a strip in here that was severely burned and we can label that and just kind of make some basic observations about what happened in there. So the trees are dead and I'm kind of worried about erosion on these steeper slopes along this one hillside. And then yellow is usually the color that's used for low severity. So like a fire that burned underneath and didn't maybe kill a lot of the trees, but maybe there's some needle scorch and so on. So maybe there's a couple areas in here that were underburned, low severity. And then we'll just say that the rest of this was moderate severity, okay? Now, in order to do this effectively and in order to be able to really dig in and do the work of assessing the soils and the potential for erosion, you've got to have some kind of background to determine when a site has burned hot enough and extensive enough to be considered high severity, when it's moderate, when it's low, etc. And so what I'm going to recommend is that you utilize this after the burn publication. It's put together by University of Idaho's Extension Service. It's available on the Our Fire program website and in conjunction with this class. And it has some really good resources. And actually a lot of the questions that we're getting asked at the previous one, this publication has pretty brief, concise sections on it that provide some guidance on doing assessments for hazard trees, assessing cambium, things of that nature. And so take a look at this. I found it to be a really useful resource. And within this, on page 33, there's this great table. It's actually bigger than this. I've extracted a piece of it here, but it does a really nice, easy to understand job of defining what a low severity fire looks like on soil relative to soil, what a high severity looks like, and what moderate looks like. And I don't want to spend a whole bunch of time walking you through each element of the table. You can refer to that if you're interested in it and find that information. Let's just approach it from a pictorial standpoint, and we'll kind of cover some of these reference point here, these parameters, if you will, relative to how soil and vegetation changes following different severities of fire. So I always think that from a fire perspective, the easy place to start is with the really high severity impacts. And so if you look at the photo here, it's pretty obvious in here that this area, let me get a spotlight going here, that this area in here of where the soil is clearly visible here in the photo, that's really different than what you would expect in an Oregon forest. I mean, we're used to having a lot of vegetation on that forest floor. And if you look here, what we see is a relatively uniform ash layer, right? Instead of the normal kind of vegetative layers that we would expect there. And if we kind of dug through that layer a little bit, we'd find that the surface organics, you know, those layers of kind of small sticks and things and needles that are partially decayed and sitting on the surface, and then the humus layer, that layer where it's partially decayed organic matter, that nice kind of brown stuff, kind of crumbly, and the dead decaying wood that's been incorporated in the soil. In a severe fire area, that stuff is going to have been consumed. It's just gone. There's just virtually none of that remaining. And so that's one of the really easy to identify criteria that help us identify when something is a high severity fire. The other thing you'll notice in these high severity areas is the small woody debris, the stuff that's less than 3 inches in diameter, is essentially gone. That stuff has burned up too. It just doesn't have enough mass to survive a longer term, higher intensity fire. With the larger stuff, and you can see a little remnant of larger diameter woody debris in here, even that is going to be substantially consumed. And so it's either going to be gone or reduced to piles of charcoal, or it maybe is charred deeply. And so not just the surface layer blackened, but if you start chipping away at that with an axe, you're going to find that char layer goes in several inches in some cases. And so it's really looking like a log that's mostly burned in your fireplace. And so those three things are pretty uniform across these areas that we would consider a high severity from a soil implication perspective. The table that I've referred to says that stumps are consumed. My observation is you can have a pretty high severity fire and our bigger stumps won't be completely consumed, but they are going to have that deep charring that would be the same as you would observe on the large woody material. These are the fires where it's pretty common that the fire over time is going to follow the roots, the dead roots that are underneath the ground, and those can smolder and burn for weeks, if not months. I mean, a lot of times these high severity areas don't actually cease burning until we get the winter rains and snows. And I've heard of cases where you can have those smoldering roots actually reignite the following summer as things start to dry out. And so it's a long-term implication from some cases from these high severity fires. Soils get changed by these more intense fires. And so while you can't see it right here, if you were to scrape the gray ash away, the soil underneath is going to have changed in color. And depending on what the parent soil was and how intense the fire was and how long it burned, those soils might actually turn black, even if they weren't black before. They may turn gray, or in some cases, they may even turn orange. Now, don't panic and think that if you're seeing exposed soil and it's one of these colors that you automatically had an intense fire. Look for the other factors as well, because we in Oregon, we have black soils, we have gray soils, we have orange soils just naturally. But if if it's a normally grayish soil and now it's turned orange, that indicates that you've had that longer term combustion at higher temperatures that can sometimes change some of the chemical nature. And that's one of the factors used in identifying these high severity sites. And then another easy one, we mentioned it right up front, this deep ash layer, that just means that there's the remnants there of really complete combustion of the area. And it probably also means that the needles and things that were in the trees above, those probably burned too, and they didn't just scorch and then fall later, they actually burned. And so what's been deposited on the site is ash. So pretty easy, I think, to identify high severity fires. So if we take the opposite end of that spectrum, here's what I would consider to be a low severity fire. So pretty different pictures here, aren't they? Notice in this case that even though we're saying that this is low severity, there is fire damage to many of the trees that were on this site. And so the heat from that low severity fire was still sufficient to scorch some of the needles. Those are going to drop. Some of those trees may die. They may recover if they have enough green left in them. But in general, we kind of look at this and say, if you look at the ground level, 40% or more of the organics that were on that site should have survived that low severity fire. So if it's burned off all the organics on the soil, that's going to bump it up a notch into at least that moderate category. But in here, if you kind of look around the area here, what would be the ground, you can see that there's still organic matter on the ground in there. There's lots of this small woody debris remaining. So it can be partially consumed, but it's not completely consumed. If we went through the forest and looked, the larger stuff, that stuff 3 inches in diameter or bigger, that's going to be maybe blackened, but it's not going to be consumed in a low severity fire. And probably in low severity fires, you're going to see that it just kind of creeps around and it completely misses places. And so there'll be patches within a low severity fire footprint that aren't burned at all. Stumps are intact, they're not burned up, they might be scorched in places. Mineral soils can be blackened, but that's usually just because the organics on top of them in that particular area got charred. And you can find some gray or orange, that evidence of what can be more intense fire, but it's going to be really localized. It's going to occur where a specific dry log burned for long enough and hot enough to create a really localized patch of actually severe intensity. But it's just going to be right there in that localized patch. And so across that area, we're going to consider that to be a low intensity fire. So pretty easy, I think, to figure out, okay, high severity, looks like that lunar landscape with some standing dead trees. Low severity, lots of vegetation left, lots of organics left, fire kind of moved through it, didn't destroy a whole lot. From my perspective, the stuff that's harder to key out is the stuff that's moderate. But I would suggest that the way you look at this is determine, is it high severity? Okay, if no, then it's going to fall into some lower category. Is it low severity? If no, then it's got to fall. If it doesn't fall into one of those two extremes, then it falls into those moderate categories. And here's a good example. So you can see through here that the fire actually burnt hot enough that for the most part, the needles on these trees, the leaves on these trees are scorched and they're going to fall. And there could be a really high level of impact on survival of these trees. But the fire itself, from a soil perspective, I would pretty soundly say that this is a moderate severity fire. Some of the indicators here, if you will, we can look in here and we can see that there's definitely still quite a bit of the large woody material still visible. There's even some small woody material in here. You can see some of these smaller ones that were obviously dead before the fire and they survived. So that's that stuff that's less than 3 inches. So that's another indicator that it wasn't a high severity. But obviously there's enough of the organics gone across the soil surface there that it exceeds that 40% limit that we have for low severity. So falls in that moderate severity. Notice that there's lots of recent needle fall. When the needles on these trees get scorched, they fall pretty quickly. And so if you were in there really soon after the fire, it would have looked like pretty bare ground. Almost immediately you start getting that needle fall. And so we don't consider these newly fallen needles to be part of that organic matter for determining the extent across the landscape. This is stuff that it's fallen after the fire. And so you have to eliminate that when you're thinking about how much of that area burned. So there's an example of moderate severity. If we look another example here, this is from more of a distance. And I think that you can look across the river here into the distance, the forest in the distance there, and you go, well, there's pretty significant impact to the trees that were on that site, a lot of scorch there. So it's unlikely that we could get away and say that that was a low severity fire. But yet you can see patches of green along the edge here. You can see lots of organic matter that survived. You can see small material kind of popping up in here in the background. So again, this is something that I would anticipate that if I walked within the footprint of that burn, I'd go, yeah, this is a moderate severity fire. Here's another example. So when I looked at this particular area, most of it was a low severity fire, but there was a draw in here that probably had a higher accumulation of organic matter, and it burnt a little hotter. And so it burned enough that pretty much all of the surface level organic matter is gone. But you can see in here that there's a fairly substantial amount of this large and small woody debris that remains within this pocket of higher severity fire. And so I would classify this particular pocket within this draw as being a moderate severity fire, and do that based on the fact that, you know, it's pretty much all impacted within this little spot here, but we still got that small woody material and the larger woody material present there. We'll come back to this photo later and talk about its erosion potential. So when fire burns, obviously it has impact not only on the vegetation on that site, but also on the soil organisms that might be present in that location. And that's going to collectively kind of have an impact on the long-term productivity and the short-term ability to revegetate. But it's also going to have some impact on whether that slope or that site stays stable as we start adding water into it this fall and winter. And so on your low severity sites, if we just kind of read through the table, again, this is from that same After the Burn publication, page 33, we would expect that a low severity burn doesn't really have a big impact on soil microbes and soil organisms. They're going to stay intact, and that's a good thing because they're going to help with the nutrient cycling and the soil permeability and the things that really allow that site to be productive as a growing site. Nutrients don't really get impacted. They remain on the site. They don't get volatilized in a low intensity fire. We're not likely to have the fire make the site more more water repellent so that we'd get this overland flow. And that means that collectively the erosion potential is low. So that the vegetation's still there, the binding effect of roots in the soil is still there. And so we wouldn't expect to have significant erosion potential just from a low intensity fire. And then as we work up in burn severity, you start to have a greater potential that we're going to see erosion occurring. And it's because we're losing more of that organic matter and the root structures, the vegetative structures that are helping bind the soil and hold it in place. But we also have the potential to actually make those soils more resistant to water permeation, to keep the water from getting into it and making it more likely that it flows overland. And if you look on the severity kind of matrix we have here, it says here that in moderate severity, water repellent layers are possible. And then as we move into the high severity, they're likely. And actually, from my experience in reading, it's actually right at the intersection of those two severity levels that you actually tend to get these water repellent layers. If you remember last week, if you watched last week's seminar, Steve Fitzgerald talked briefly about how this happens. So when a fire burns up organic matter, if it burns hot enough, it actually vaporizes or volatilizes the organic matter. And if there are cooler soil particles below where those organics are being volatilized, they can actually condense on the soil particles and bind them together. And that makes them quite repellent to water. You can, in some of these soils, you can put drops of water on the soil and they'll just sit there. They don't soak in, they just sit there at the surface. And that means if you have a rain event, instead of having that water sink in and move through the soil where it's slowed down, its energy is dissipated, instead it's going to move over the soil. It's going to get moving faster and faster. It builds up energy and that allows it to move soil particles, and that's what starts that erosion potential. And that actually happens at the upper end of the moderate burn severity range and the lower end of the high severity burn range. And the reason for that is it has to be hot enough to actually cause that volatilization, but still cool enough that those chemicals can condense on the soil particles in the soil. If you get a really hot burn, it actually just consumes all of that material and there's nothing left there to condense on the soil particles. So that water repellency, you'll hear it called hydrophobicity, soils becoming hydrophobic. That happens kind of at that higher end of moderate severity and lower end of high severity, just kind of for reference. And then that combines with the kind of absence of organic matter to hold the soils together and leads to those increasing potentials for erosion. So again, let's look at some photos rather than just talking about a chart here and kind of put some of this in context. So here's a site that probably experienced an upper end of the mild or low severity fire into probably more like the moderate severity. It burned up a fair amount of the organic matter, and now you can start to see that there's some very slight surface erosion starting to happen across the soil surface here. There might have been a little hydrophobicity here. It could just be that the soils were more naturally erodible and lacking the organic matter. Instead of water diffusing into the soils, now it's being able to kind of funnel into these areas and concentrate its energy, and it starts to erode in those potential areas. That's a relatively low severity example. Here's a couple more extreme ones. And these are where we start to really get worried across the landscape. So roadsides that have those steep sides, and now you've got more water coming off the slope above because it doesn't have its organic component anymore to slow that down. Maybe there's some hydrophobicity of the soil going on there. It's channeling that water. We're getting higher peak flows, and there's significant erosion activity going on here on this photo on the left side of the screen. The one on the right side of the screen is pretty typical down cutting of a stream bed or a channel here, just because we're getting more, not to say more water, but the water is coming across the slope surface and then impacting into that channel, and the peak flows are higher. So the energy associated with the water movement is higher than what it would have been pre-fire. And that's a pretty common post-fire event or impact, to see that down cutting in the channels, that exposure of bedrock or these larger cobbles that are more resistant to movement. Here's another example. So if we think about just across the landscape, what areas are most likely to be impacted? Yeah, the high severity fire areas are likely to be impacted, but also you've got to think about slope and some of the underlying soils factors. So here, this is a pretty flat area, and so it's unlikely that we're going to see a bunch of erosion, even though there was a lot of the organic matter burnt off of this site. And so flatter areas, less erosion, pretty obvious. Here's more extreme slope. And this kind of demonstrates that we think about slope, but we also think about underlying soils. And so in this case, it's steep enough that there's going to be pretty significant flow of water over this surface just because of its overall slope there. But there's really no underlying soil here to erode away. This had very thin organic soil over bedrock. And so what's going to erode? Well, it's not really going to have water-based erosion here into the underlying bedrock. But what you are going to see is that because the organic matter is gone, all of these little rocks that are sitting up here on the slope, this stuff is going to start to roll or ravel down the slope, and it's going to end up on the road below and in the ditch. So if this is a paved road maintained by the county or state, it's going to be their responsibility to maintain those ditches and things, right? Not yours. But if this is your forest road, you should be really thinking about these kind of slopes. One, because there's increased hazard to you when you're driving in and out during and after rain events. But also you're going to have to pay really close attention, because if this slope raveling, even though it's not technically a high erosion potential, if it fills up your ditches and impedes the movement of the water, that can make it more likely that your road will fail or that your culverts will fail. And so you could have pretty significant implications for that. So I would say that wherever you have forest roads in burned areas, really watch those, get them as clean and as well repaired as possible before you go into the rainy season, and then watch them to the extent it's safe to do so during the course of that rainy season, because you're going to have to do more repair and maintenance on those roads than what you would normally have had to do. And that's going to be a longer term effect. It's going to take quite a few years for the organics to build back up on this site and cause that to go back to its more normal level of erosion into your ditches. The places where I would be really concerned are where we have exposed mineral soil that already has a potential for erosion, and now we've added fire to that. So if you look at this site, we have removed the organic matter from the site, so it's pretty bare. It's burned hot enough that I would anticipate that there could be some hydrophobicity of the soil, some of that water repellency. There's enough large material in here that, we know we're not at the upper end of the high severity. And so this really looks like an ideal spot, if you want to call it that, to have some hydrophobic soils, which could really lead to that overland flow. That's going to exaggerate the already existing erosion occurring in this channel. So you're going to have to really watch for that. So this may be one of those areas, if you had something below it that was a target, this would be an area where I would want to be really thinking about some slope stabilization of some sort. And finally, coming back to this picture, just because a location looks like it has erosion potential doesn't necessarily mean it's a place where you need to rush in and do a lot of immediate stabilization. So we looked at this one before and said this was probably a moderate fire. This one probably wasn't hot enough to introduce that water repellency. It probably didn't fuse those soils. And you could check that just by doing some drop tests with an eyedropper to see if the soil infuses or the water infuses into the soil. But regardless, it's not a big area. It's not going to move a lot of water into this drainage. And the fire didn't burn hot enough to consume the vast majority of the organic matter that's in here. So there's a lot of that like small and larger woody material that's going to help stabilize this site. So this is an area that could have some erosion, but it's probably not going to have a huge amount because much of the larger material is still in place to hold it in place. And so I think it's good to just evaluate and look at those factors. Classic places where we get really concerned about erosion, in addition to those kind of road cuts and things of that nature, are in these larger valleys where the fire now is going to mean that there's going to be a much faster overland flow, much less penetration of the water into the soil than what was pre-fire. And this is an area where that can really result in some flash flooding issues within these drainages. And so certainly if you've got bridges, culverts below this, if you've got homes maybe off on a terrace off to the side, these would be areas that I would be concerned about and want to be thoughtful about how I interacted with that. This is a photograph, I think this actually came out of New Mexico, but it looks a lot like some of our forests here. And it's just really common that we've got these kind of rocky slopes here, and they can really change dramatically following a fire. And I want you to just kind of look right here at where we've got this tree coming out of the soil, and then look up here and notice how dense this is post-fire. This is 1 year later, and you can see that there's been flash flood, debris torrent type situations occurring in this drainage that have filled the lower end of the drainage with rock and debris. They've literally torn out a bunch of the small wood that was in this drainage, and they've piled it up here, and they literally piled a couple feet deep of debris around the base of that tree that we looked at in the previous photo. And so these are the areas where we've got this high potential for erosion over the surface, but also the more extreme and dangerous potential of debris torrents and flash flooding that could be present across your landscape. And this is where really having professionals do those more landscape level assessments to say what's the potential impact in the drainages, in the watersheds. That's where you've really got to be focused for thinking about the bigger long-term potential for damage. So what do you do with all of this stuff? We build this as not only a matter of kind of helping you understand the background and how to do the assessment, but what do you do now? So I want to focus on some pretty low-tech things that you as a landowner can do to improve or maintain soil stability across your forested landscape. As I mentioned before, I'm not going to get into a bunch of detail around how you do that around your homes and structures. That's kind of beyond the purview, although I've got them listed here, and there are some of those more intensive kind of structural alterations that you can do. I'm going to point you to some resources that you can go to for more assistance and technical assistance that might be specific to your home and property. So let's start with kind of maybe these first 5 in here that are the ones that are really pretty low tech, simple ones that you're likely to be able to do on your post-fire property. So let me start with this. If the fire left behind organic material on the surface of your soil, leave it there, because this is by far the best way to mitigate post-fire erosion, is to leave the existing ground level organic matter in place to the maximum extent possible. Leave that stuff in place, because you look across this landscape and there's a ton of larger woody debris, there's smaller woody debris, there's a lot of the organic matter in there. Even though it burned through lightly, there's still some grasses that have been left in patches across this. So I would really leave this in place, and this is going to be kind of a long-term stabilizing effect across that part of the landscape. So really important to retain that to the extent possible. Also, to the extent possible, if you have these areas where the fire has gone through and it may have consumed the organic matter, but it scorched the trees, that needle drop is really important. Don't think that you need to go out and rake that up. Even if you have another fire through there, it's not going to support any significant level of fire intensity. And this is an amazing natural mulch. It's natural materials. It's organics that came from the site. It's what nature would have naturally reincorporated in that site. So this is by far one of the best mulches that you can have, is just let that natural needle fall occur on that site, and that can be really beneficial in helping stabilize the soils in the short term. So leave that natural stuff on site. Then beyond that, if you've got areas that were, say, fire trails across your property, those might be places where you need to do some additional work to stabilize that, because just by their nature, they're going to be places where water can accumulate, build up speed, and start to have that erosion potential. These are often areas where we'll come in later and do some work with some straw. Straw is a really inexpensive, great mulch. Just some warnings though. To the extent you can, it's better to use weed-free, certified weed-free straw, because the last thing you want to do is have to go in and deal with invasive weeds in all of these areas now that you're trying to stabilize. So if you can get a hold of it, weed-free straw would be the way to go. I have a suspicion that it's going to be in short supply, and so you may need to use regular straw. And if you do, just be aware that you're going to have to do multiple passes through that over the next few years to be watching for invasive species developing, and just manage them quickly before they become a big problem. So straw, fantastic, low expense, easy to apply, does tend to blow away, but that's a really good mulching material to help stabilize and help those soils stay in place and let the water just kind of permeate back into them. Similarly, if you're grinding up woody debris that was on the site, don't haul that stuff off. Those wood chips are going to be a super valuable resource for mulching. They're heavier, and they tend to be great for stabilizing the little bit steeper slopes and stay in place a little bit better. They don't blow away, at least not under normal wind circumstances. And so use those to the best of your ability on the site. And a lot of times you can just do your chipping so it blows it right into the area that you want to stabilize. And so that's a pretty good option for you relative to providing some mulch cover. Really recommend that you not get over exuberant with mulching. A couple inches of straw mulch, or maybe an inch to inch and a half of wood mulch, is going to be plenty for most purposes. And if you start getting thicker than that, then you're going to have problems with natural vegetation regenerating on that site, and you want to let that nature do its work in there. So don't get it too thick. Not much reason to do that, and it can actually be counterproductive. Those straw bales can be similarly useful in stabilizing some of these stream courses. And so we saw the effect in one of those previous pictures of water being able to build up speed and move that stuff down through that water course. Straw bales can be used to form these little check dams, and the purpose is not to dam up the stream, but to slow things down and to get it to deposit the material, the rocks and woody material and soil that it's carrying, and deposit that more frequently. If you look really closely in here, there's not just one of these here. There's another one back up a ways, and so there's a combination of those. If it was me, I'd have another one in here. Depending on how steep it is, you're going to have more of these. And so the steeper it is, the more closely spaced these check barriers have to be in order to capture that. Because really what you're trying to do is slow the water down, and the longer space you get between those structures, the more speed it can build up. Straw bales are not heavy enough to resist water pushing against them, so you're going to have to stake them in place. I recommend using wooden stakes. You could do it with rebar, but then you've got metal structures in place, and that could be an issue if you're coming in later to do salvage logging and using rubber-tired equipment. And so just be cognizant of that. So straw check structures, really simple way to mitigate some of that erosion potential in these drainage areas. The fire probably left you with an abundance of dead and dying trees. And if you were to fall some of those cross slope and then kind of wedge them in behind stumps and existing trees that are remaining, maybe use your Pulaski and dig out a little bit and get them to set down against the soil, or even a little pocket in the soil. These cross slope log barriers can be really effective at reducing the amount of erosion that occurs across slope. And so really effective, and the materials are already there. A great way to use some of that standing dead material, particularly if you're not going to be able to do salvage logging immediately. So really good for that. And you can see in here already that there's already, this has been like a year and a half after the fire, and there's already soil and rock accumulating behind this, and really that stuff that would have eroded off the landscape, but we're keeping it in place. It also, as soon as it kind of fills up behind that with the soil, it makes a spot where water pools, and then instead of having that water continue across the landscape, it pools there, and then penetrates in. And it really helps improve the permeability of that landscape. So great for reducing that cross slope movement and erosion. In places where you don't have the wood available, these straw wattles can be very effective. And they're another pretty low tech system for providing that barrier that slows that cross slope movement of water and soil and rock. They have to be fairly frequently placed, particularly on steeper slopes. I've got a couple examples here. The one off to the left is actually a roadside where they're trying to stabilize, but the one on the right is a very typical kind of landscape picture following fire, where you've lost a lot of the surface organics, and that's soil that they deemed to be sufficiently erodible that they knew that they had to have something in there. And notice that there's lots of them. And again, if you go to the publication that I gave you as a guide, it's going to give you advice on how close those need to be in order to be effective. Just like with the straw bales, straw wattles typically need to be staked in place in order to remain there. Otherwise, you're just going to have a pile of straw wattles at the bottom of the slope after the first rain. So really stake them into place in order to keep them and let them do their job. And then pragmatically, think about your forest roads. And one, you're going to do an assessment. You're going to be wanting to look for areas where there's already debris that's accumulated in the ditches. You're going to want those to be as clean and well-maintained as possible. You're going to want to inspect your culverts and make sure that, particularly if they were plastic culverts, that they haven't burnt. They can actually melt and collapse. So you're going to want to make sure that they're open and accessible and can carry the water load. And I would just recommend that if you are seeing places where you need to replace culverts, anticipate that your peak flows after a fire are going to be higher and more extreme than they were before the fire. You're going to get more of that overland flow when it rains, instead of having that water soak in and then kind of come out over a longer period of time into that water course. It's going to happen faster. And so you're going to get higher peak flows. And so think about oversizing your culverts if you have that opportunity. Armor them, make sure that you're prepared for that. And then really pay attention over the next several years, because this is going to be a continuing problem. You're going to want to make sure you keep them clean. Don't let them get clogged up where you can build up water pressure behind them. Keep your ditches clean. Just be really on top of your road maintenance across your forested landscape. That's going to be the best way that you can maintain that really significant infrastructure investment. You'll notice that I didn't talk about seeding as one of the ways to mitigate erosion potential. And that's because while it's frequently done, the truth is the science says it doesn't actually work very well. So one thing is that if we did it right now, we would be applying it at a time of the year where the rains are probably going to come before there's any real potential for it to germinate and actually get its roots sufficiently established. So much of what you apply for seed at this time of the year, if there's any slope at all, it's going to wash away before it actually becomes useful. And so not very good from that perspective. The research that I've seen recently says that in about 70% of applications post-fire, this material just washes away before it actually gets established. So only 30% of the time is it even likely to work. And then if it does work, then you've got to be thinking about what seed did I actually use and what have I introduced into my environment. So have I used native seed? That would be the ideal, rather than using something that's offsite, because you've got a real potential for introducing vegetation in here that isn't productive for the regeneration of the native species. Even if you use native seed, have you been able to obtain native seed that's native to your region? Because if you haven't, it's kind of like saying I've planted Douglas fir trees where Douglas fir trees used to grow, but they could be from completely out of the region. And so now I'm introducing genetics that really don't work for that site. And there's a big concern that in doing this, we're introducing non-native genetic sources. So I am a big proponent of letting nature do what nature can do. So think about what is the pragmatic, logical stuff that you're going to do for your property there, and then let nature do what it can. It's going to probably start off with lots of hardwoods regenerating. They typically, even if they've killed a tree, they're going to sprout from the stumps, and then it's going to take longer term for those conifers to reseed in, but it happens over time. You can supplement that by planting, and Steve Fitzgerald is going to cover lots of that in the future seminar. Again, for key resources, really recommend this publication, After the Fire. We've linked it in several locations, and so that's a great place to go for follow-up to all the stuff that I've said. And then for the more technical how-to and more stuff around your home, the Natural Resources Conservation Service has recently released this really well done set of fact sheets on stabilization. We've linked that as well. It goes through all of the stuff that I've talked about plus more. And so if you want to think about dikes and diversions and barriers around your home and things, there's material there for you. And I just want to sum up by putting this in context and saying, you know, do this in a way that's pragmatic and practical. You've got tons of stuff to think about. So use the checklist effectively, and then safely do that assessment of your property and look for the high priority areas. You're really in a triage mode right now. You're thinking about what are the things I absolutely have to do. Take a ton of photographs of the places that you're concerned about, and make that sample, make that little map, that simple map that identifies where there are burned areas, where there's not burned areas, where you see problem. And then take that to your NRCS office, your local NRCS office. I don't want to overwhelm your NRCS technicians, but I know that NRCS is making a big attempt to relocate people, get more people in places where there's been these burns, and really have that resource there. And even if they're not the right people to help you, they will know who to direct you to if it's around these soil erosion issues. They're really going to be good at that. And then for stuff more around your home, think about your insurance agent, your homeowners association, your county emergency management department, or I'm betting that if you are in one of the recent burn areas, there is some community organization that is already working to work within that community area to really point you to all of the available resources. I know we've got a great resource here in the Glide area for Douglas County that's doing that. So I'm going to leave it there and take my last few minutes to answer a few questions, but hopefully this gives you a basis to think about evaluating your property.
Fantastic job, John. That was super thorough and hard to get all that information in such a short amount of time, but I think you did a really great job. We are almost at time, but there are a couple of quick questions that I think we can answer quickly. One had to deal with any timeline on when the burn severity maps might be available. We haven't been allowed into our burned timberland yet, which is near Forest Service land.
So I think Catherine is on the phone and she's working on those. I'm wondering if she can answer that question.
Yeah, hi. I'm Catherine Rowden with the National Weather Service. I'm helping with the state private land assessment, erosion threat assessment reduction team. So the Forest Service is currently working on that, like John discussed at the beginning, taking the satellite map and then doing the soil samples on the ground and refining that to reflect actual conditions. And most of those, I shouldn't say most, a number of those are done and ready. So it really depends on what fire you're looking for. And I think, John, you had mentioned when we talked last week that OSU would be hosting those as well for the public to obtain. So a number of those are already ready, I think, for Holiday and Riverside, and I think Beachy and Archie will be coming out soon. Lions, well, anyways, I'm not going to say something inaccurate, but they are coming out as we speak. Some are already ready. So.
Yeah, and Daniel, I think, can speak to where we are with the OSU process.
Right, really quick. I know we're running out of time, but yes, we've made contact with FEMA, with OEM, with hopefully with Catherine, and we're pulling together a web page with a story map tool that will not only bring in these severity maps from Bear, but remember, some of those have not been ground checked. So it's still important to know what John has been saying. It's still important to do your map, but we will have the severity maps that were already done on this web page intersected with your tax lot. So hopefully you can pull your tax lots, get the severity map, get the soil maps, but please ground verify if you can. And that's going to be in the next week or two.
Great.
And then if I can, Carrie,
Yes.
maybe if it's okay, I'll just really quick kind of answer some of the questions I'm seeing here. So one, there's a comment from Liz that says that watershed councils and other groups can often use hazard trees that you're taking down. And that's a really good observation. And so if you've got hazard trees and you can make those connections, yes, by all means, because there's places where those are going to get used in stabilization and habitat restoration. So there's a lot of opportunities for that. So again, I'm pretty confident that if you go to your NRCS office, they'll be able to point you towards those folks, but connecting with watershed councils is also a really key way to work on some of those erosion issues. There's a question here about, other than soil movement and erosion, are there other indicators to identify potential hazardous slope damage? And an obvious one there is the slope itself, and any evidence that there was erosion occurring beforehand, right? But remember that the hazard of the slope is just like the hazard of the tree. It depends not only on whether the slope is likely to move, it also depends on what's below it. So is there something for it to impact? And so is there a risk associated with that? So I would look at those two things together, and then refer you to the reference material that I gave you there. That guide there has some more detailed information in it.
Hey, John.
Yep, go ahead.
Before you go on to answer more questions, I'm going to suggest that we follow up with those questions via email, because we are at time and I want to be respectful of our attendees' time. And I don't know if I cut you off mid-answer. If I did,
nope, we're good.
Your answer. Okay. So I think there's just one or two questions remaining, and we will follow up with those in an email. That wraps up our session for today. Don't forget to join us next week, same day and time. That's October 15th at 3 p.m. for presentations on assessing tree mortality and salvage logging. I want to send out a huge thank you to the presenters who provided a lot of great information today. And to you all, thank you for joining us and staying online for 2 hours. We recognize this is a difficult time for so many of you, and we appreciate you tuning in to these webinars. You know, webinars are just one way we can provide information to you during this time of COVID. This webinar has been recorded. Feel free to share it out. Again, that's on our fire program website that Tiffany sent the link out a couple times in chat, and I will send that via email. Finally, if you have a moment, please tell us what you thought about today's presentation by filling out a very brief summary immediately following the webinar. A pop-up window should appear in your browser. Stay safe, everyone. See you next week, and good night.